I became moderately popular on YouTube after I uploaded a video about Old English, which was a pretty bad video. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And at first I made more videos about Old English because I didn't want to scare off viewers by making videos about other topics. But more recently actually quite a long time ago, I branched out into other topics, and people don't seem to have been too scared off by it. I think I have an audience who shares my interests probabilistically. So I thought it might be nice to actually do a proper big video on Old English pronunciation and how it's reconstructed phoneme by phoneme, feature by feature, because I realised that if you wanted the wind's going to mess with the audio, isn't it? I realised that if you wanted to find all of my videos about Old English pronunciation, you'd have to kind of dredge up a lot of things of massively variable quality, hugely stylistically inconsistent, and it just wouldn't be a very satisfying experience at all, and probably I'd make quite a lot of mistakes the earlier you went, or I'd omit massive important things. So I thought this video I will do something as well researched as I can at this point in my YouTube career, and hopefully people can use it as a bit of a reference video, or just sit and watch the whole thing if you're like me and you enjoy watching hours of boring shit. So what do I mean by Old English? In short, I mean the language of the people that we call the Anglo-Saxons, and the language that Beowulf was written in. And in long, I mean the 600 or 700 year span of English that stretched from the 400s AD to very roughly the Battle of Hastings and the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings. Now, at both ends of this spectrum, it's fuzzy. The early days of Old English are characterised by us not knowing anything about it, really, not having any attested texts. What happened was that there was what we call a dialect continuum spoken in northwestern Europe of closely related West Germanic dialects. When I say Germanic, I don't mean German in the modern sense of the word. It's an unfortunate coincidence, well, not entirely a coincidence, that the same word is used for both. But we're not talking about modern German at all. We're talking about languages like, I suppose, Proto-Old Frisian, Proto-Old Saxon, and things like that. And various speakers of these dialects settled in Britain. It's a lot less cut and dry than the account that Bede painted of the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians and the Jutes settling in Britain, in different parts of the country. It's becoming increasingly clear that it's a lot more complicated than that. But basically, speakers of lots of dialects that were probably mutually intelligible with each other, these people could probably understand each other, settled in Britain, and then, because they were all in the same place, their dialects seem to have levelled to some extent and then re-diversified into the dialects of Old English. So then you had a dialect continuum stretching up at the height of Britain. And these dialects diversified into the 1000s AD. And then at the late end of the spectrum there, after the Battle of Hastings, you again have a very blurred line between Old and Middle English, because it's not as if the Normans showed up and then all of a sudden everybody started speaking a different language. Very gradually, the inflectional morphology, a lot of aspects of the grammar of Old English started to get eroded away, and the odd French loanwords started to trickle down from the upper classes who spoke French. There was not an abrupt change at all, and the whole way through, parents were always speaking the same language as their children and their grandchildren. There was never an abrupt change where suddenly everybody decided, let's start speaking Middle English now. So at both ends it's a blurred line, but this is the period that we think of as the Old English period, and specifically I'm going to be aiming for a late West Saxon dialect of Old English, and this is the dialect that was spoken roughly in the south of England, those parts of the south of England that spoke English, in maybe the period from 900 to 1000 AD. The reason I'm going for this isn't because it was considered any kind of standard. As far as we know, there wasn't really a standard Old English in the way that there's a standard Modern English. But this is the language that most of our surviving texts are written in for various historical reasons, so it's the one that we can say the most about. I will discuss other dialects, probably in some detail, but Late West Saxon is the one that we'll sort of use as a focal point. Our evidence for Old English comes from two different alphabets, which are only very, very loosely related to each other historically. They're, to all intents and purposes, practically they may as well not be related to each other. And these are the runic alphabet, in which a relatively small amount is written, and a version of the Roman alphabet similar to what we use now, in which the majority of material is written. The fact that these are both alphabets is very useful because it means that we have a good probabilistic idea of how many sounds were in each word, which words started with the same sound, how many sounds there were overall, very roughly, and so on. Obviously, any learner of modern English will be able to tell you that, alphabetic spelling systems don't always line up perfectly with the pronunciation, and we can't assume that to be the case here, but it's a good start. It's better than having a logographic writing system like Chinese, in which case we might not have any idea what the sound system was like. So from these writing systems we can tell that Old English had a very similar, the same general syllable structure as all Indo-European languages that I'm aware of, and I think all languages in general, although I won't push that point because I don't know every single language, so maybe there's exceptions. But this syllable structure is that syllables tend to consist of a central nucleus, which is usually a vowel, a louder sound, a more liquid sound, the kind of sound that can be dragged on for a long time. And then that nucleus is surrounded on either side by optional clusters of consonants. So those may be single consonants, there may be nothing before the vowel, there may be nothing after the vowel, or there may be a cluster of consonants before and a cluster of consonants after. So you have this basic structure, and if you look at Old English as it was written in the Roman alphabet, and you assume that all of the symbols that represented vowels in Latin also represent vowels in Old English, you end up seeing basically the syllable structure that you would expect of an Indo-European language. So that this gives us a good idea that it has exactly the syllable structure that we'd expect it to have. Can we use these writing systems to tell anything about the suprasegmentals of Old English? In a language you have what's called a segmental phonology, which is the sound by sound structure of words, but then you also have suprasegmental things which are considered to be kind of above the level of the individual speech sound, and these are things like which syllable in the word is stressed, if the language even has contrastive stress, is there tone like there is in Chinese, is there pitch accent like there is in Swedish, and this is quite an easy question to answer in Old English, not because of the spelling system, because stress is not marked in spelling in Old English, or I think there are rare cases where it seems like it was, but almost across the board it's not marked. But basically all Germanic languages have this pattern where if you pick a native Germanic word that's descended all the way up through the language's medieval history from Proto-Germanic to the present day, that word will have stress on the first syllable of the root. That is the first syllable that isn't some grammatical prefix. This is true in modern English, this is true in modern German, this is true, as far as I know, in all modern Germanic languages. It doesn't apply necessarily to loan words that come from other languages, so Norman French loan words or learned borrowings from Latin. The stress rules on those words may be different, but for native Germanic words, the stress tends to fall on the first syllable of the root. And so we can assume with some confidence that this was true in Old English as well, regardless of what dialect of Old English we're talking about. If you needed anything else to bolster that, metrical evidence from Old English poems supports that very strongly. So in Old English poems there tends to be this alliterative structure where certain words within the metre are supposed to have the same first sound as each other. That's a slight simplification, but if you look at metrical patterns in Old English poetry, it seems like this same rule applies of words alliterate with each other if they start with the same sound or the same letter, barring grammatical prefixes. So I'll put an example on screen of a case with a grammatical prefix where there's alliteration barring the prefix. So I think we can assume with great confidence that the stress system in Old English was the same as the stress system is for modern English words which are descended from Proto-Germanic and Old English. What about things like tone? Indo-European languages tend not to have tone. There's bound to be some example that I've missed, but the way that Chinese has tone, where a syllable can have an upward tone or a downward tone or a down and then up tone, this doesn't really seem to appear in Indo-European languages. The exception to that is in a small few languages that have what's called pitch accent. So Swedish is actually an example of a North Germanic language that does have pitch accent. So I think in Swedish, pairs of words can be distinguished based on the exact pitch contour that the word is said with. So an example that I've heard used in a pretty good YouTube video is that the word tomten means something different to the word tomten, with the only difference in pronunciation being the kind of what you might call as the lilt on the second syllable. There's no evidence that Old English had any kind of pitch accent, and all of the arguments that I've seen about the origin of pitch accent in Swedish suggest that it's a North Germanic specific thing that arose at some point in the kind of Old Norse, in the Viking Age or in the later Old Norse period, and that it had something to do with specific syllables dropping out of words in that branch. So there's no reason at all to think that Old English had pitch accent, and given that most Indo-European languages don't have it, we're left to assume that Old English didn't have it either. I would point out that not having contrastive pitch accent in the way that Swedish does doesn't necessarily mean that Old English didn't have the kind of uppy-downy cadence that Swedish famously has. I'm not saying it did, I'm not saying it didn't, but the thing I'm saying it didn't have is situations where words are identical other than the exact pitch accent that's on the word. That's something Old English almost certainly didn't have. Whether it had some kind of lilty intonation pattern or sing-songy intonation pattern or whatever impressionistic words you want to use to describe it, that's completely unclear from the text that we have. There's no descriptions of Old English intonation, and so anything above the level of word stress we're really not sure about at all. Whether people went up at the end of a question or went down at the end of a question, or what, we don't know anything about that kind of intonation in Old English. I'm going to start by discussing the monophthongal vowels. Vowels in general are a very thorny area of Old English phonology. I'll start by just defining some basic terms, and you can skip this if you've heard it all before. But a vowel is a speech sound that's made without complete constriction of the vocal tract. The vocal tract is the gap inside your mouth going down your throat, where you put food when you're eating, but also where you produce speech sounds. So the way that you produce sounds is that you move and shape the muscles surrounding the vocal tract, so those are the lips, the tongue, the soft palate. You move those muscles to change the shape of the cavity so that the cavity ends up with different resonant frequencies, and then you blow air through the different resonant frequencies, and that makes different sounds. So all the time when you're speaking, you're just changing the shape of the vocal tract to produce a stream of different sounds. A vowel is a sound where you're not completely closing off the vocal tract at any point during the pronunciation of the sound. So I, ow, e sounds like that. That's kind of intuitive because I think we all kind of know what a vowel is. A monophthongal vowel is less intuitive to English speakers because we don't really, it's not really consistently represented in our spelling. A monophthong is a vowel where the articulation, the way that it's pronounced, stays the same all the way through the vowel. And so the sound, the acoustic, formant spectrum stays exactly the same, or more or less exactly the same, the whole time you're saying it. So an example would be I, O, A. You can hear that the sound stays the same the whole time. This is as opposed to a diphthong, where the sound changes while you're pronouncing it. Ow, I, L, ear, ew. There's something about the sound that changes while you're pronouncing it, and that's a diphthong. So writing systems don't necessarily tell us the difference between monophthongs and diphthongs, even if they're alphabetic. In modern English, the letter I can represent a diphthong, I, or it can represent a monophthong, I. So we can't assume that one vowel letter in Old English equals one monophthong. There could be complexities that that aren't obvious to us from the spelling system. I think we can be very, very confident about which letters in Old English represented vowels, because for one thing, Old English used the Roman alphabet, and so the letters that represented vowels in Latin probably represented vowels in Old English as well. It's clear from the way that Old English words developed into modern English that when Old English writers adapted the Roman alphabet to fit their own language, they weren't just randomly pairing letters with sounds. They were working on basically the same correspondences that Roman writers used, with the proviso that Old English had a different pronunciation system, so it was never going to be perfect. So, if a Latin writer uses this letter to represent the S sound, then an Old English writer is going to do the same thing. So that's a big clue that the Latin vowel letters probably represented vowels in Old English as well. There's also the fact that vowels usually form the nucleus of a syllable, the middle of a syllable, with optional consonants before and afterwards. And this means that if you have a word which consists of only one sound, especially in an Indo-European language, that sound is very, very likely to be a vowel. And there are quite a few words in Old English that only consist of one letter in spelling. And so those letters tend to be what you'd expect to be vowels in Roman, in Roman alphabetic convention. So that's another reinforcing point that those are vowels. Old English also isn't an island. It's related to lots of modern languages, and where you find what you'd expect to be vowel letters in Old English, those correspond to actual vowel sounds in modern languages that are related to Old English. So I don't think it's controversial at all to say that these were these letters represented vowels in Old English for the most part. So let's start with the letter I, which corresponded to one symbol in the runic alphabet, the runic orthography of Old English. In general, we know that this letter tends to represent something in the I corner of the vowel space across Indo-European languages nowadays, including Classical Latin. That's a good starting point. Obviously, words in Old English are in many cases the direct ancestors of modern English words, and cognate with words in other Germanic languages. In that sense, this Old English vowel corresponds with certain vowels in modern languages that we have audio recordings of. Now, I want to avoid confusion here and make an extremely important point about historical linguistics. Language is a spoken phenomenon that exists in all human cultures. Sometimes it's a signed phenomenon, but in most cases spoken. And all languages are pretty much equally complex. They have extremely complex grammar, they have complex phonology, and you could argue about certain languages being more complex in certain ways than others, but that complexity has basically nothing to do with whether the language has a writing system or not. It seems incredible if you've never studied linguistics before, but having a writing system does not make a language more expressive, it doesn't make a language more complicated, it doesn't make a language more sophisticated at all. Any linguist or anthropologist or even missionary who's tried to, analyze the language of some remote to the west group of people who don't have a writing system will tell you that their languages are just as complex as any Indo-European language that has a writing system. And there's no reason to think that Old English was any different to any other modern human language. It was completely fully formed, it had an internally consistent grammar, and it did have some kind of consistent modern pronunciation system with dialectal variation, but a normal modern sound system. We're not talking about a half-formed language, we're not talking about a primitive language, we're not talking about people who are confused about their language. That's another thing that I see a lot in the comments of these videos and also just elsewhere online, the idea that people become confused by spellings and the idea that people mistake certain letters for other letters and that influences the way they pronounce things. By and large, that doesn't tend to happen. Spoken language is a phenomenon pretty robust against spelling for the most part. Spelling is just a tool that's used to represent spoken language. Now, of course, a lot of importance has to be placed on spelling in our case because it's the only access that we have to the spoken language of Old English. We don't have audio recordings of it, and so spelling is our best proxy for it. So when I talk about letters in Old English corresponding to modern English sounds, you should bear in mind that I'm crossing wires slightly, because letters do not create sounds. Sounds create sounds. It's just that we don't have access to the sounds of Old English other than through the proxy of the letters that they use to spell them. So firstly, how does this vowel show up in modern English? Taken across a large sample of words, you'd notice two broad directions that it tends to take. The words here are from the Wiktionary Swadesh list of Old English, which is just a list of words for common things that most languages probably have. I've excluded examples where the words don't exist in mainstream English anymore as well-known words. It either becomes the I sound, as in 5 time wide, or it becomes the I sound, as in thick, fish, drink. Now let's take the same sample of words, switch them with their cognates in German, if there is a German cognate, and look at the vowels there. In these cases we find a slightly less stark pattern, but two similar sounds emerge in a large percentage of cases. In a standard German accent these are I and I. In a statistically significant number of cases, where you have modern English I, you have modern German I. Where you have modern English I, you have German I. If we chuck away the Old English evidence, it would look like this is a pretty ancient distinction between two sounds, predating the English-German common ancestor. It's possible for two vowels to merge in a given language, and it's possible for one vowel to split in two in a given language. But the pattern that we see here doesn't really make sense in line with what we know about how those mergers and splits usually take place. When one sound splits in two, it's usually environmentally conditioned somehow. There's usually a rule, like sound A becomes sound B if it's followed by an alveolar plosive and stays as sound A in other environments, or something along those lines. As a result, you can usually see a statistical pattern even after the split has happened. There's no such pattern that explains why the Old English sound represented by the letter I may have split into modern English I and I. Sound changes also don't have a memory. Once a sound merger has happened, it can't unhappen along the same lines because it can't remember which words had which vowel before the merger. So is it possible that the distinction was preserved all the way through to German and to modern English, and that Old English writers used the letter I to represent two spoken sounds? Well, we do that very thing in modern English, and it would suddenly make it all make a lot more sense. But Old English writers put these two sounds under one symbol, both in the Roman alphabet and in runes, so there might have been some reason that they saw the two sounds as similar or belonging to the same category somehow. There are lots of ways that vowels can subtly differ from each other. For example, they can be nasalized, pharyngealized, but one possibility that lingers in a lot of living Indo-European languages, and was certainly present in some better documented ancient languages like Latin, is length, where how long you hold a vowel for can change the meaning of a word. Is it possible that the letter I in Old English was used for the long and short versions of the same vowel quality, something like I versus E? On the one hand, this seems a bit weird. Both English and German have some kind of I-like vowel sound where Old English has this letter, phonetically not very similar to E. But on the other hand, when Old English writers fitted the Roman alphabet to their language, they were certainly not randomly matching letters to sounds. They were trying to keep roughly to the letter-sound correspondences of Latin, which you can still see with the majority of sounds in modern English. Within that constraint, there was quite some variation in early Old English spelling, probably because different writers had different regional accents and things like that. And yet, as far as I know, there are no examples of what's normally I being spelled AI. This is the spelling you'd expect if there was a sound like I in these words. Okay, so maybe it wasn't I in Old English. What does this letter correspond with in other modern languages apart from German? The tide starts to turn here, and we see why German isn't a very typical Germanic language. In most of the other Western North Germanic languages, the vowel in words like white and wife tends more to being I or I. The earliest writings across the Germanic languages, at least those that use the Roman alphabet rather than the Gothic one, opt for the letter I and not the AI digraph. If the vowel was high, front and unrounded, something like I, it would explain a lot of things. If it wasn't, it would raise a lot of questions. But a vowel is part of a wider vowel system, and the field of phonetics has established that vowel systems tend to conform to certain patterns, so it would help us to know what the rest of the vowels are looking like. If we can put them all in similarly rough positions, and if that then looks like a natural vowel inventory, we'll know that we have a pretty good theory about their pronunciation. The letter U also corresponded to just one rune, and also has various reflexes in modern English. A reflex, by the way, is the modern descendant of a sound in an older stage of the language. Two very common reflexes emerge. Ow, as in mouth, louse, and as in shove, dust. Now this is a slightly more confusing case at first glance, because the letter U in European languages tends to represent a high back vowel with lip rounding, something like oo. But neither of our most common reflexes sound much like oo at all. Well, here we've run into a pitfall of only using one modern accent, my one. If we allow ourselves to use any accent that's existed within the era of audio recording, in this case the Cumbrian dialect I'm quite familiar with from northwestern England, the pattern then starkly changes. The reflexes are now oo, as in loose, mouth, and as in tongue, shove. This Cumbrian tongue shove vowel also absorbs a couple of words that were stragglers in my accent, because it's also the vowel in full, and in some people's accents, would. If the Cumbrian pattern were closer to the Old English one, the spelling choices of Old English scribes would make a lot more sense, both in terms of why they chose the letter U and why they represented both sounds with the same letter. The cognates of these words in other early medieval Germanic languages are also widely spelled with a U, so we'll revisit this, but let's assume for the time being that the Old English letter represents two sounds, both phonetically similar to U. The letter E is more difficult. Again, it corresponds with one rune, but has more than one modern reflex. The most common reflex is very much in line with how European languages tend to use this letter, a mid-height front unrounded vowel. Another common reflex is E, a bit more left field based on the spelling, which seems to be the pattern so far with the other letters. And then we have quite a lot of stragglers with other reflexes. I suppose with this letter the signal to noise ratio is just lower. In other words, a much higher percentage of the words are stragglers with random other reflexes of the vowel, compared to words that have the two most common reflexes. Okay, now let's move on to O. Again, there's one rune corresponding to this Roman letter, in the Wiktionary Swadesh list I've been using as a source of words, the letter O doesn't actually appear very much, or most of the times it does appear, it's in a sequence of vowels which I'm excluding for the moment. So we have the potential for a very inconclusive outcome. Indeed, very inconclusive. The most common reflex, barely, is O, well in line with the spelling compared to other European languages that use the letter O. A very statistically insignificant second place is which we've also seen as a reflex of the letter U. Well, let's press on with the other vowels, and if they all follow the more common pattern, maybe we can use that to examine O a little bit more. The letter A has a much stronger signal-noise ratio, emerging with 2 strong reflexes and a few stragglers. There is A as in sand, which is what you'd expect in line with the letter, and O as in stone, which is our wildcard other pronunciation. There's also this letter ash, which is a ligature of A and E. This corresponds to one rune and is broadly treated as one single letter in the Old English corpus. I think, as English speakers, we have a bit of an instinct about this AE ligature, that it should be pronounced something like A. And I think the reason we have this instinct is it's not because of something intrinsic about the letters, because of course letters at the end of the day are just squiggly lines. Any instinct we have about them is based on our learned associations between letters and sounds that we've developed as we've grown up. And I think in this case it's just the fact that in English the letter A can represent the sound A or the sound A, and often it's shown to us that it represents the sound A because there's a letter E later in the word that modifies, or sort of diacritically modifies the letter to tell us which pronunciation we should use. And so when we're doing made-up-on-the-spot phonetic transcriptions of words, we may choose to use AE to represent the A sound. An Old English speaker has presumably completely different learned associations, and probably, well, we're almost certain, thought about this letter in a very different way to how a modern English speaker would. Most modern scholars agree. In fact, I think probably pretty much all modern scholars agree on a rough pronunciation of this in Old English. So this is not something that's debated in the field, and that's the case with quite a lot of these things that I'm saying. But of course, I'm building it up from the ground up in this video because I think that's not really done elsewhere. So let's have a look at this and see what this letter's reflexes are in modern English words. This is possibly the biggest jumble yet, with almost all noise and no signal. In other words, no modern reflex really stands out. Just barely ahead in this list is the modern vowel e, as in flesh, dread, but tied with each other are air, as in there, a, as in ash, e, as in seed, and a, as in tail. I think the first thing to do is what should have been done a long time ago, taking environment into account. As I said, we can sometimes tell where one sound has split into 2, because we can still see signs of the environments in which it changed or stayed the same. We can see that all instances of modern air appear in situations where the Old English vowel was followed by an R, meaning that they may well have split off from another category because of a sound change that happened in that environment. Put another way, these reflexes taking a separate vowel quality probably isn't because of any categorical difference in Old English. The same is true with the A sound. This occurs when the letter ash was followed by a G in Old English, so we can accept this may have been an environmentally conditioned split that's happened since the Old English period. More weakly in our sample here, we can see that you get a modern vowel with lip rounding if the Old English letter ash comes after a W. I can tell you that this pattern gets stronger when you pull in more words like wasp. This looks very much like a conditioned sound change. If you look again at traditional Northern English dialects, our pattern levels out a lot. Wat, water all now take the same vowel as adder, ash, and at, making this ah vowel the winner of the competition, as it were. This complicates things because the normal letter A in Old English also has the ah vowel in modern English as its most common reflex. This is easy in historical linguistics terms. These were originally 2 different sounds, and at some point in due course they've merged with each other. The final single vowel letter is Y. This has a similar outcome to the letter I, producing the modern English I and I sounds. Here it looks like whatever sounds the letter Y represented in Old English, they ended up merging with the sounds represented by the letter I. So we're now left to work out how these sounds were all pronounced in Old English. With each vowel letter presumably representing at least two sounds, what was the difference between these two sounds, and why were they spelt with the same letter? Let's first take the vowel quadrilateral, a two-dimensional plot showing the sounds of vowels, very roughly corresponding to where the tongue is in the cavity within the mouth when you pronounce the vowel. See Dr. Jeff Lindsay's video on the vowel space for some expert detail. If we assume the typical European vowels represented by these letters, we're looking at I, U, E, O, and A. However, we have to make room for the extra vowels. Probabilistically, the reflexes of the normal A are more likely to be vowels with a back tongue position in modern English, and the reflexes of the ash are likely to be vowels with a front tongue position in modern English. And as languages' vowel inventories tend to be fairly symmetrical and very spaced out, why don't we put them here for the time being? A and A. The A sound is acoustically somewhere in the middle between the A sound and the E sound. So, with no prior idea of how the Roman alphabet should be used to write English, it would make perfect sense for Old English scribes to select this ligature to represent the A sound. So that just leaves the letter Y. Some analysis reveals that the letter Y bears a relationship to the letter I in Old English. The two letters alternate with each other in inflectional paradigms. What do I mean by this? Well, in Old English, nouns, person, place or thing words, changed to reflect the role that they played in a sentence, whether they were nominative or accusative, or whether they were singular or plural. For a word like this, which means mouse, some grammatical forms are consistently spelt with a U and some with a Y. This suggests that at some point in history, the ancestor of the sound represented by Y was the same as the ancestor of the sound represented by U. That it changed in certain phonological environments, and then further sound changes destroyed the distinction between environments so that you can no longer see the pattern of where they split. The usual interpretation of the letter Y is that it represented a vowel with the front tongue position of E, but the lip rounding of U. In other words, E. This is the same sound that modern Standard German represents using a letter U with two dots or umlauts above it. This would suggest a fairly normal sound change called assimilation, where one sound takes on characteristics of a neighbouring sound. The idea would be that all of these U vowels were originally just U, but then there was a regular sound change where if U was followed by an E in the next syllable, that U gained a front tongue position to assimilate to the E, so the U becomes E in those situations. This is obscured slightly by the fact that in many of these words in Old English, there isn't the necessary E in the next syllable that this sound change would suggest. But structural evidence from other Old Germanic languages strongly suggests that these words did have the necessary E vowel at some point in history, or a Y semivowel, which presumably had the same effect, before it was lost in Old English. Take this Old English word, fyllan, meaning to fill. Here you see the letter Y, but no I in the following syllable. If you look to the Gothic cognate of this word, however, you do find a high front semivowel in the following syllable, y. So if there was this high front semivowel or something like it in a prehistoric stage of Old English, that would explain the assimilation. This kind of assimilation in Old English and other Germanic languages is called I mutation, because sounds mutate when they're in the presence of the letter I, or the E sound. Sometimes in Old English videos I've been corrected by people saying my U vowel wasn't front enough or wasn't rounded enough. Now I could be corrected on a great many things in my Old English videos, most of them grammar related, but in this case it's people maybe trusting the standard symbols too much. I think there's a lot of wiggle room in what the pronunciation of this vowel might have been. I'd say something like E is among the most likely options and it's the one that textbooks will teach you, but I don't personally see any reason why it couldn't have been a bit further back, like U. It would still easily be different enough from U to maintain a phonemic separation. While we're on this topic, I will point to one digraph and cluster of two letters that we haven't covered yet, OE. I'm going to cover most of the digraphs in the next section, but I mention this one here because it's very clearly a result of the same process of assimilation as the sound represented by Y. It appears in situations where Originally, there must have been an O followed in the next syllable by an I sound. Its pronunciation is reconstructed along similar lines, a vowel with the same tongue height as O, but at the front of the mouth and with lip rounding that prevented it from sounding too much like E. In other words, scholars tend to have it as Ö, a rounded front mid-height vowel. I think the same stipulations apply. I think Ö is probably the most likely option, but I don't think there's any strong evidence against a more central pronunciation like or even The reason I do reckon that U and the front tongue positions, are marginally more likely is that ultimately both sounds went on to merge with the front unrounded vowels. U eventually just became E, and became E. Immediately before this change, it would make sense for the rounded vowels to have fairly front tongue positions, so just a simple unrounding of the lips would result in the merger. So the basic monophthongal vowel system arranged by tongue height, frontness, backness, and lip rounding would look like this. I, U, U, E, Ö, O, A, R. In late West Saxon, the dialect that most modern textbooks take as standard, this Ö had already ceased to exist, merging into E. This is a very convincing, natural-looking vowel system. In fact, it looks a fair bit like German's monophthong system nowadays, with a distinction between unrounded and rounded front vowels, but no such distinction among the back vowels. I go as far as to say that you couldn't stray far from this basic interpretation without things becoming unrealistic in accordance with the evidence. But there's definitely wiggle room. Firstly, as I've said, double this number of monophthongal vowels must have existed if you consider that each vowel letter seems to have represented two separate vowels. This can only really be something like a vowel length distinction, where each of these vowels can be pronounced either long or short, and this length distinction is so important that it can be the only difference between two different words. In this model, two Old English words spelt G-O-D would be different in that one would be pronounced God with a short vowel, and the other God with a long vowel. This is more likely than any other possibility for a few reasons. Firstly, there's a strong precedent for vowel length distinctions in Old Indo-European languages, and in fact the apparent vowel length distinction in Old English bears a statistical relationship with the one in languages like Classical Latin, with cognate words often having the same vowel length status. Later stages in the history of English also show the remnants of a long-short distinction. Phoneticians writing in the 1500s described the monophthongal vowels as being arranged into pairs of one long and one short. Because this has got very abstract, I'll try to rephrase the basic conclusion here. Old English words could contain any of a number of monophthongal vowels, some of which were long vowels, vowels held for a longer time, like I, U, A, and some of which were short vowels, vowels held for a shorter time, like I, U, A. These vowels can be sorted into pairs, so that each short vowel has a long vowel with the same quality, and vice versa. You have short I and long E, short O and long O. This length thing was an important difference. If you held a vowel for the wrong length of time, then you might say the wrong word. However, Old English writers just spelt the corresponding short and long vowels with the same letter. Short I and long E were both just spelt with the letter I, usually with no written modification to tell you if the vowel was long or short. Likewise with all the letters, long O and short O were both just spelled with an O, and so on. This was probably from a combination of there only being so many letters in the Roman alphabet, and the correct word usually being gettable from context anyway if you were a native Old English speaker. If you're trying to speak Old English, pure vowel length can be difficult to get right if you don't have it in your own native language. It exists in some dialects of English, including mine, although it's not in the same words as it was in Old English, it's reappeared in a different set of words. If you have a similar accent to me, you can model Old English vowel length on the difference between words like bed and baird, which despite the now misleading spelling, many of us distinguish based only on vowel length, bed, baird. With this as a model, you can get an idea of how different long and short vowels tend to be in living languages that distinguish them, and then you can apply that to Old English. Bed versus bed, uck versus ark, God versus God. It's easy to exaggerate the difference, especially if you're not used to vowel length, but in living languages that distinguish length it's usually more subtle because speakers have been exposed to the difference since birth pretty much, and so they're very sensitive to it. However, there is some debate about the finer details of these length distinctions in Old English. They may have relied entirely on length, like God versus God, or they may also have involved a difference in the quality of the sound, maybe God versus God. This is common in modern Germanic languages. German has pairs of vowels which are distinguished by both length and quality, like I versus I, or U versus U. Perhaps Old English had similar such distinctions, with long vowels having a tenser tongue position and short vowels having a laxer, lower tongue position. There are arguments for a purely length-based distinction, I versus I, and arguments for a length and tenseness-based distinction, I versus I. Many of these arguments for a length and tenseness distinction relate to the development of the vowels in Middle English. In many of those cases, vowels in a long-short pair with each other split apart and end up pronounced very differently. In particular, there are some situations where short vowels at the start of the Middle English period lengthen into long vowels. In these cases, some short vowels lengthen into a lower long vowel than the one you'd expect from the spelling. For example, the short vowel spelled with I lengthens not to the long vowel spelled with I, but to the long vowel spelled with E. Some researchers would argue that this development is less surprising if those short vowels had a lower tongue position than their long counterparts to begin with, and so when they lengthened, they merged into the lower of the two vowels that they were nearest to in the vowel space. I think this is a decent argument for some or all short vowels being laxer than their long counterparts in the early Middle English period, but I don't know that the evidence is convincing beyond that. There's no reason to think that the phonetic qualities of these vowels in 600 AD were the same as they were in 1100 AD. I'd call this somewhat inconclusive, and I get the impression that the writers of most of the main textbooks aren't that committed to either phonetic interpretation, pure length or length and tenseness. Although Old English writers usually didn't indicate length in their texts, most modern textbooks will indicate it by putting a macron over long vowels. It's important to remember Old English writers didn't do this. This is just for convenience because, none of us are native Old English speakers anymore, so none of us have an intuitive knowledge of where the long vowels are. Within the vowel systems of natural languages, there are often cases of allophony, which means that one phoneme has multiple allophones. In fact, I would say that every phoneme has some kind of allophonic range of exactly how it can be pronounced. But sometimes one phoneme can be pronounced in two fairly different ways, and it seems like this may have been the case with the short sound represented by A in Old English, which we've taken to be ah, or something like ah. When it comes before the letter N, this is sometimes spelt with an O, but sometimes spelt with an A. This alternation happens even within one text, so a single writer, a single scribe, might flip between spelling this with an A or with an O before the letter N. So clearly there's something going on here. Now, there's a tendency in other languages for N to cause low vowels like A to round, to nasalize, and possibly to raise slightly. Another example is Polish, where the normal, the letter A normally represents an A sound, but the letter A with a gonek, a hook under it, represents a nasal sound, on, which is a lot more sort of backed, rounded, nasalized than the normal A sound. Basically, it seems like a similar thing was true in some dialects of Old English at least, where A became something like on if it came before n. Now, this didn't completely merge with O, generally speaking, and we know that because writers still sometimes spelt it with an A. And this trend started off kind of scattered across the entire English-speaking part of the country, and then later on it became more of a north-specific thing, and southern dialects seemed to stop doing it. This may be the biggest ungodly minefield in Old English phonology and phonetics. Diphthongs, as I said earlier, are vowels that involve a moving gesture within the vocal tract, either the tongue starting off low and moving higher as you pronounce the vowel, or the lips starting off unrounded and becoming rounded, or whatever it might be. Random examples are ow, o, yeah. Hopefully you can hear that there's a change in the sound as the vowel is being pronounced. Old English writers sometimes employed sequences of 2 vowel letters in a row. Now, we can't assume right off the bat that these all represented diphthongs. After all, I've already said that OE probably represented a monophthong. We need to look at how these vowels correspond to the vowels of living languages related to Old English. The 2 most common of these digraphs are the spellings EO and EA. Let's first look at EO as our main example to start off with. The most common outcome in modern English is E. There are a couple of runners-up, E and R, the latter R only occurring before the letter R. There are a couple that turn out as I, and then a few little stragglers. Okay, what does this EO digraph correspond to in other Germanic languages? Well, where it ends up as E in English, it corresponds to spellings like IO or IU in other early West Germanic languages, and various pronunciations in living languages. Where it ends up as in modern English, you see spellings from I to E in other Germanic languages depending on the word. Some of you might already have realised the edge of what researchers struggle with here. This is looking an awful lot like the situation with the monophthongs, that the EO digraph represented 2 or more different sounds in Old English. If this were just like the monophthongal vowels, we might pursue the possibility that there's a length distinction, a long version and a short version of the EO sound. But the balance of probability at the moment suggests it might be a diphthong. Are there such things as long and short diphthongs? It's certainly a sort of fringe case. It's not very common for a language to distinguish diphthongs by length. In fact, I think there may be only a tiny handful of examples of living languages that do that. Maybe the most sensible thing to do here is to look at how these sounds might have developed from pre-Old English through Old English into later stages of the language. One of the 2 paths of development immediately jumps out as fairly unsurprising if you take all the historical spellings completely at face value in relation to the normal European pronunciations of Latin letters. If the pre-Old English quality was something like iu, as other early Germanic languages point towards, then it wouldn't take too many gymnastics for that to turn into something like eu, which could eventually monophthongize to give a Middle English quality like e. I've made a lot of assumptions there for the sake of a quick reconstruction, and this is worth analysing more, but that's a pretty solid normal development. So that leaves us with cases where it looks like it was a short vowel, but somehow still a diphthong in Old English. Our sample from the Swadesh list is too small to do any proper analysis, but I can say that on the whole, it's likely that the short version of this EO vowel in Old English came from an earlier E sound, and in fact developed back into an E, or perhaps slightly lower E sound, after the Old English period. So, to reiterate, this is a lot like what we see with other vowel spellings. In mainstream Old English, one written digraph, EO, seems to have represented 2 different sounds. The balance of probability is that one was a normal diphthong, which was something like iu in West Germanic, developed to something like eu in Old English, and then eventually went on to e in Middle English. And the other sound started as e in West Germanic, a short vowel, became God knows what in Old English, and then went back to being e again afterwards, or perhaps the slightly lower quality e. Separately, there's the normal short e sound, which we discussed in the section on monophthongs, which was e before the Old English period, e throughout it, and still e, or e, afterwards. Okay, this is starting to suggest a split of some kind between the short e that stayed pretty much the same throughout Old English and the short e that went on a little detour and became EO. As I said, splits usually require an environmental conditioning rule, so can we find one here? The statistical pattern here is complicated, so I thought I'd do a little aside. The presence of diphthongs in Old English bears a statistical relationship, as I said, with the presence of certain vowels in Proto-Germanic, which is an abstraction from the rest of the Germanic languages in their written forms and eventually their spoken forms that we have access to. And also there are clusterings of certain features to particular dialects. So if a text has features of a certain dialect, that's a statistical predictor that the diphthongs will turn out a certain way in that text, be distributed in a certain way across words. So the patterns here are complicated. It's not as straightforward as the account I'm about to give. And while a lot of this stuff is statistically predictable, falls into a certain statistical pattern, there are always a few little stragglers that don't fall into the pattern. There are plenty of ways of explaining stragglers. Those are not a damning thing at all in sound change. One way that stragglers can arise is where one dialect borrows a word from another dialect, so that word doesn't end up having the pattern of sound changes you'd expect because it's got some of the sound changes of that dialect and then some of the sound changes of that dialect. Stragglers can also arise because sound changes don't always apply in every single word where the phonological environment is met. So an example from my accent would be that early modern English normally becomes r before certain voiceless fricatives, and that would suggest that the word chaff, as in the agricultural byproduct, would be pronounced chaff, but I pronounce it chaff, so do most people with my accent. So that's an example of a straggler in a modern dialect where the pattern of the sound change is very clear. So we expect there to be a few stragglers, but most examples are predictable by a complicated statistical pattern. And I'm just going to give you the outcome of when you analyse that pattern and try to interpret it in terms of sound changes that make sense by our modern understanding of how sound changes tend to happen. So the pattern researchers have found is approximately as follows. Where pre-Old English had the short eh vowel or the long vowel, there was a straightforward, normal, conditioned sound change. Where they occurred before a consonant with a velarized articulation, with the body of the tongue pulled back to the soft palate, the vowels started to gain this glide element. As and are front vowels, the tongue has to suddenly adopt a back articulation straight afterwards to make the back consonant that follows. And this process of diphthongization was just a result of the tongue doing part of that movement while the vowel was being pronounced. This actually happens in my own accent of English. If the O sound comes before a velarized O, I say it differently. Goat versus goal. It's the same kind of sound change in Old English. If you had early Old English elch or erde, they became elch, erde. In situations where long did this diphthongizing, it ended up merging with the existing diphthong that had been inherited from West Germanic. The situation we see in Old English spelling is messier than this. There are situations where you'd expect diphthongization but don't usually find it. A small number of other regular sound changes, sometimes dialect-specific, can explain a large number of these fringe cases. But the initial condition for diphthongization is fairly clearly as I've just described it. Front vowels diphthongize before velarized consonants. That being the case, it's very likely that, at least in the early days of this diphthongization, there was genuinely a length distinction between a short version, perhaps something like ew, and a long ew. Or is it very likely? This is a situation where two vowels, short and long underwent a similar change to each other because they had a shared characteristic of both having the same vowel quality. Vowels often change analogously with each other because of a shared characteristic. Think about how the face and goat vowels in Geordie English have both diphthongized to ear, for many speakers because of their shared feature of having a mid-high tongue position. But outside of Old English, I don't know of any examples of this happening to a long and short vowel with the same quality as each other, so really I don't think we know what the phonetic outcome would be in that situation. However, in this case, I think it's likely that it was a length distinction, because Old English writers, who, as Richard Hogg points out, were pretty phonetically intelligent in deciding on their spellings, seem to have deliberately indicated that long and short are are paired with each other, in the same way that long and short are paired with each other. I can tell you now that the same things are true of EA spellings. It seems like it broadly represented two sounds. One was the survival of the West Germanic O diphthong, which went on to become something like in Middle English, and the other was a development of the short A sound from pre-Old English, and ultimately went on to become A in Middle English. All the same things seem to have applied. In prehistoric Old English, both long and short A and A turned into backing diphthongs if they were followed by certain velarized consonants, perhaps ow and ow. The long ow merged with the existing diphthong from pre-Old English, and indeed early written Old English has examples of this spelling straightforwardly suggesting a pronunciation of something like ow. Later in the Old English period, and in fact for the majority of the period, the favoured spelling changes to EA, which is of uncertain phonetic interpretation. The spelling suggests long air, short air, but I think phonologists dislike this because it makes for a not very neat vowel system. To understand their full interpretation, we have to move to the third major diphthong. This is at first spelt I-O, and all the same things apply. It came from a Proto-Germanic diphthong, probably iw, and then in prehistoric Old English, long and short I diphthongized before velarized consonants. The long one merged with the existing diphthong, perhaps as ew, and the short one made its own short diphthong, ew. These are rarer in Old English writing for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they seem to have been more resistant to diphthongization somehow, with lots of examples of words just avoiding this sound change. And secondly, in many dialects, ew and ew merged with ew and ew. The spellings I-O, E-O and E-A hint at a diphthong system that was a bit weird by Germanic standards, but not totally implausible. Most researchers favour the idea that this system tended towards being height harmonic, that is, the starting point of a diphthong wanted to be at the same tongue height as the ending point. This makes for a nice symmetrical vowel system, and vowel systems in living languages like to be symmetrical. The basic pattern of development is fairly clear, but the phonetic details and timings, I would say, are highly unclear. Most scholars opt for this, bearing in mind the short and long equivalents of each diphthong are presumed to have had the same qualities, with just a pure length distinction. They start off as ew, ew, ow, then they flick to ew, ew, ow, with diphthongs that stay approximately the same height throughout their articulation. And then at some point in this process, I umlaut hits. Remember that change whereby if a vowel is followed in a later syllable by the I sound, it changes accordingly? Well, I umlaut affects different dialects differently, as we'll discuss later, but just know that it produces an extra possible diphthong, spelt IE. It's widely accepted that the pronunciation of the IE diphthong is unclear, perhaps even more unclear than all of the other diphthongs. The probabilistic consensus is that it was long ew, short ew. In other words, the normal E vowel followed by that front-rounded U vowel. Another way to think about it is that it's just E, but your lips get more rounded as you say it. Ew, ew. I think researchers postulate this for developmental reasons, stepping back from a direct interpretation of the spelling, which would of course suggest ear. In the late West Saxon dialect, this IE diphthong turns either just into an E or an E, which is maybe one of the reasons that researchers want to suggest EU in its earlier form, because that keeps a rounded and an unrounded element that we see in those later West Saxon reflexes. I think this is a case of maybe stretching the limits of inference to find the marginally most likely pronunciation. I don't think we can know with confidence what this was or how it might have differed across dialects. The way these will normally be described in textbooks are as diphthongs with a pure length distinction, where the short diphthong is just a straightforwardly shorter version of the long one, so short, el, long, el, for example. And their qualities are normally given as ew, eo, el, and our. Now, most textbook writers don't very rigidly commit themselves to these pronunciations, and normally they're just phonemic transcriptions anyway. They're in slashes, which means the writer is trying to tell you this is a phoneme, and it's not necessarily pinpoint phonetically accurate. So if they were in square brackets, that usually indicates a more phonetically specific transcription, because that's a way of denoting phonetic transcriptions. There are other videos where I've gone through the difference between phonemes and phones, phonemics, phonology and phonetics. But basically, we shouldn't necessarily take these phonemic transcriptions too seriously. There's the question of, if this was pronounced our, why was it not spelt like this? Why was it spelt ea? I think maybe textbook writers lean towards the pronunciations that I just outlined because they adhere to this height harmony thing, whereby the diphthongs have a starting point that's equivalent in height to the ending point. Now, you may well ask, what about the case of eo? If you're somebody who likes phonology or phonetics, you may point out, well, e is a high vowel and o is a sort of mid-height vowel, so that's not height harmony, surely it should be eu. I think what's happening here is that, well, my understanding of this, my interpretation of this, is that historical linguists are looking at the spelling, which is usually io rather than iu. Now, that doesn't tell us very much, because as I've just said, the ea spelling is interpreted as our rather than er, so spelling doesn't necessarily tell us much on its own. But also, among unstressed vowels towards the end of the Old English period, there are only 2 vowels that can appear in unstressed syllables that are back vowels, and those generally in West Saxon texts are u and a, as in nama and wudu. So perhaps what's happening here is that the first element of the diphthong is conforming to the stressed vowel pattern of distinguishing 3 tongue heights, so e, e, a, and the unstressed vowel pattern or rather the second part of the diphthong is conforming to the unstressed vowel pattern of only distinguishing 2 tongue heights. So because of that asymmetry between stressed and unstressed vowels, you have the eo and the eo diphthongs sort of collapsing into the same end tongue height. This is a theoretical description that makes sense to me. How that translates into phonetics, how realistic that is on a phonetic level, I don't know. I don't know enough about phonological theory to judge. But I trust the people who know more about it than me, especially in terms of the diphthong represented by ea. Pronunciation guides in books and online will give you all sorts of interpretations of this. Some will just go our, some will take a more direct phonetic interpretation of the phonemic symbols that linguists use, and they'll say something more like our, which is, I think, just as possible as our. Some people will just directly abstract from the spelling and say something like air, because they know that e represents e, and that a represents a, so they'll just go straight from the spelling. This is certainly possible, increasingly possible towards the end of the period, where we know that in Middle English it ended up as something like air, just a long monophthong. So that isn't impossible, especially towards the end of the period. Unlikely in the early part of the period, I would say. And then some people will do a kind of weird modern English accent thing with it and say like aya or aya or aya, which is I think what's happening there is that when modern English speakers hear an e phone, because some dialects of English nowadays have that where others have a, so like Scots say name rather than name, people have this kind of equivalence between e and a, even though they're quite different sounds. And so when people hear it's supposed to be e followed by a, they think, oh, aya, which is, almost certainly not what the quality was in Old English, but if you can't pronounce any of the others, then... Another thing I'll address is that I know when I talk about diphthongs, I bring in a lot of I bring in a lot of phonological theory about how many tongue heights did the Old English vowel system have, and how the unstressed vowel system distinguished fewer tongue heights, and, front, rounded and unrounded vowels were distinguished in the front non-low vowels and not in the, whatever. And although these might seem like absolute nonsense statements that academics are using to try to justify their pay, they do actually, in modern languages, these kinds of phonological analyses do pretty well explain the patterns that we see in the phonetics of these languages and how speakers think about sounds. Exactly why these strange abstractions seem to apply so well when speakers aren't aware of them most of the time is, as far as I know, that's unclear. We're not exactly sure how these statistical patterns are regulated by speakers without them even realizing it. But the statistics show that they are somehow regulated within speech communities, and so that's why these kinds of analyses are applied to ancient languages as well. They also often explain pretty succinctly why certain sound changes happen in modern languages, and so again, that's why they're kind of used as a way of explaining and theorizing about sound changes in Old English. So it's not just a load of nonsense, and in order to explain our interpretations about Old English phonetics, I have to go a little bit into this phonological theory. I know that some writers don't like the idea that Old English had a long-short diphthong distinction because short diphthongs are unlikely or not possible. I need to dig more into the literature on this, really, so I'm happy to be corrected if there's anything I've missed, which there probably is. But I get the impression this is mostly from a phonological angle, mostly from the angle of either, the fact that there aren't any, or there are barely any modern languages that are interpreted as having pure length distinctions in the diphthongs, or from a more kind of structural angle. This is getting into technical terminology that I'm not completely sure I know the normal definitions of, but if the short vowels are monomoric segments and the diphthongs are bimoric segments, then the long diphthongs in Old English are easy to account for because they come from normal diphthongs in Proto-Germanic, as far as we can assume. So those are bimoric, and they continue to be bimoric, so they're just unproblematic throughout the period. And then the monomoric short vowels from Proto-Germanic turn into monomoric diphthongs, and I think the problem is, how can you shove two vowel qualities into a single mora, a single, timing unit, if you like. And that's obviously not really a phonetic problem at all, in the same way that in my own accent I can distinguish bed and bed, or bid and beard. I could easily learn to distinguish belt and belt. I wouldn't have any problem with that, I don't think. There are also some modern languages which are analysed as having long vowels and short vowels, where some of the short vowels are clearly phonetically diphthongs for a lot of speakers. So traditional RP, received pronunciation, is one example of this, where you have vowels like R and U, which are interpreted as long, and then you have short vowels like A, and clearly for many speakers of traditional RP, that was diphthongal in some situations, so it's something like A, but it's still considered to have been a short vowel. I think this is more a problem with that analysis of RP. I don't think it really had long and short vowels, as I think Jeff Lindsay would probably agree with. I can't think of any examples of him saying that exact specific thing, but the point is, I don't see any I don't see any phonetic reason that long and short diphthongs wouldn't make sense, and they seem to be the thing that the structural evidence points towards. lots of languages have features that are uncommon, and certainly if your reconstruction of an ancient language has a really unusual feature, that is a reason to be skeptical and to say, maybe I've reconstructed it wrong. This would be a lot more satisfying if it looked more normal. But, you know, the truth is that modern languages have weird features sometimes, and most of Old English phonology is pretty normal. So the diphthong system being a bit weird is not, you know, it's not a cardinal sin. If this was a video about the phonological development of Old English over time, I think unstressed vowels would be a much bigger topic, but given it's more about the phonetics and how it was pronounced exactly, I don't think they're that big a topic really. Unstressed vowels are vowels that appear in unstressed syllables, so in modern English an example of that would be in the word butterfly. The t bit of the word is unstressed. And indeed, in modern English, those unstressed vowels are usually collapsed down to one or sometimes two qualities, either or sometimes I. So for me, chicken and thicken have two different unstressed vowels. Chicken has I, thicken has but most accents just collapse those into one vowel. Now, German has a lot of in its unstressed vowels as well. To my shame, even though I speak a certain amount of German, I don't actually know whether it's analysed as only having one possible unstressed vowel or whether there are a few. But the point is, to have your unstressed vowels be very central, sounds Englishy and sounds Germany, and so it's another one of these traps we might fall into, assuming that Old English did the same thing and that any word final unstressed vowel, for example, has to be I think we're much more likely to fall into this trap if the vowel is spelt with an E, because in modern German this unstressed final is spelt with an E. So heiße, you know, it's spelt with an E and it's pronounced something like So Old English, West Saxon, late West Saxon Old English had, and I've mentioned this in a footnote earlier, it had a three-way distinction in unstressed vowels. Where those were in an open syllable, usually right at the end of a word, you could have a letter A, a letter U, or a letter E as the unstressed, representing the unstressed vowel. If it was a closed syllable, for example, if there was like a word final N and there was a vowel before it that was unstressed, it could be A, O, or I. So in both situations, there are only three possibilities of an unstressed vowel that you could have. So this is generally analysed as there are only three unstressed vowel phonemes. There's the low one, which is spelt with an A. There's the front non-low one, which is spelt with an I in closed syllables and an E in open syllables, and likewise with the back one that's spelt U in open syllables and O in closed syllables. Whether these were pronounced the same as the stressed vowels spelt with the same letter is not completely clear. They may have been a bit more centralised. So for example, the A may have stood for something like A rather than O, so it could have been like nama. The E again may have been more centralised. It could have been like hatte rather than hotte. Likewise, the U could have been more centralised, so it could have been like wude rather than wudu. My instinct would be to say the more centralised these vowels got, the more likely you might be to see variant spellings. I don't have any proof of that, but that's my reason why I personally think that the qualities were probably still reasonably peripheral. Probably something like nama, hatte, and wudu. Could be wrong, probably depended on the dialect. Certainly the distribution of unstressed vowels depended on the dialect, so you often see the letter E in unstressed syllables in some dialects. You often see the letter ash at the end of a word in some dialects. So yeah, it's definitely something that differed from dialect to dialect in pronunciation as well as in the phonological situation. Whereas vowels are pronounced with the vocal tract open, consonants are pronounced with the vocal tract obstructed somehow, with some kind of closure. Just like with vowels, consonants can be pronounced more orally, with the soft palate raised to force all of the air into the mouth part of the vocal tract, or more nasally, with the soft palate lowered to allow some air to escape through the nose. Nasal consonants are extremely common across world languages, and they're very uncontroversially reconstructed in Old English. In Latin, the letters M and N represented these nasal consonants, and so that's what they've come to represent in most languages that use the Roman alphabet nowadays, including modern English. M generally represents the bilabial nasal, made with the soft palate lowered and the lips closed, M, and N represents the alveolar or dental nasal, with the soft palate lowered and the tip of the tongue at the gums or the teeth, N. If you look at the many, many Old English words that are ancestral to modern English words, you find a straightforward pattern. Where there's an M in Old English spelling, there's a M sound in modern English. Where there's an N in Old English spelling, there's a N sound in modern English. This correspondence extends into other Germanic languages, and even just into other Indo-European languages. Occam's razor says that we should choose the simplest explanation that assumes the fewest unprovable things, and that is that in Old English the letter M represented a M, and the letter N represented a N sound. This is straight down the middle, by far the most likely situation. Is there any wiggle room at all? Could these possibly have been slightly different sounds? Well, we don't know the full range of Old English dialects, so there's always the possibility that in some small village they merged the nasals with the voiceless plosives and it never made its way into writing or something. Okay, so M and N are overwhelmingly the most likely sounds associated with these letters in Old English. There are a few other considerations though. Across European languages, the letter N can often represent the velar nasal, ng, ng. As an English speaker, it may be tempting to say, that's not a sound in its own right, it's just an N followed by a G. But in fact, it is a separate sound. It's debatable whether this ng sound is a phoneme in its own right in modern English. In some dialects, like in Manchester and Liverpool, it only occurs before a g sound, thing, sing, finger, and so on. And so phonemically it's analysed as the realisation of the n sound when it comes before a g. In other traditional dialects, rarer nowadays, it never occurs before a g, so that singer and finger rhyme. In this case it can be analysed the same way. When a n phoneme and a g phoneme come together in sequence, they're realised as a ng. But in most English dialects the situation is more complicated, with ng occurring both with and without a g sound afterwards. Thing, sing, but finger. There are arguments for and against ng being its own separate phoneme in these dialects of modern English. Old English is usually reconstructed as having a similar pattern to the Mancunian one, with ng sequences in all of these situations. I think this is probably just a triangulation of the most likely pronunciation. Ng is clearly the older situation, which has coalesced into ng in some dialects. It's possible ng occurred on its own in some Old English dialects, like thing rather than thing, but I think thing must have existed in at least some dialects, possibly all. Sometimes in Old English texts consonants can be doubled, and this applies to most consonants, not all of them. The doubled consonant seems to actually represent a phonological phenomenon, because writers very consistently spell certain words with doubled consonants and certain words with single consonants. The only exceptions are at the ends of words, where sometimes you'll see doubled consonants, sometimes you'll see single. So in those situations maybe the distinction was starting to deteriorate a bit. In modern English intuition, I think a doubled consonant would make us think that the previous vowel was a short lax vowel. The preceding vowel to the consonant was a short lax vowel. So the difference between this word and this word would be that this is beta and this is bata, because the doubled consonant indicates a short lax vowel preceding. In Old English, this doesn't seem to have been the case. It doesn't seem to have had much to do with vowel length, because, as I said earlier, the pattern of vowel length is clear by looking at how the vowels developed into modern English, and no such pattern of development corresponds to where the doubled consonants are. So the most likely explanation here is that the consonants were actually just pronounced for longer if they were doubled in spelling. So this is something that we call gemination. So to put it in a sequence, it's the difference between amma and amma. Amma, amma. To make it more obvious, amma, amma. Now, in natural speech, I don't have doubled consonants in my own accent of English, so I can't exactly attest to what sounds naturalistic here, but I imagine the same would apply as with the vowels. So it's a lot more subtle than you would think it is, probably in most cases. So maybe fremman or hatte rather than fremman or hatte. Plosives are consonants made by obstructing the vocal tract in some way, storing up air behind the obstruction and then releasing the air suddenly. These can be anywhere on the spectrum from voiced, which means that the voice box is buzzing throughout the articulation, b. They can be voiceless unaspirated, which means that the voice box starts buzzing just after the release, b. Or they can be voiceless aspirated, which means that the voice box starts buzzing a while after the release. P, p. You can hear that there's a few milliseconds of voiceless air before the voicing starts, which it sounds a bit like a puff of air. P, p, t, t. Of course, as I say, this is a kind of spectrum. You can start the voicing at any point, and some plosives can be more aspirated than others. Many modern Germanic languages have complicated patterns around this voice onset time thing, with phonemes having complicated interlocking realizations that speakers aren't usually aware of. My dialect of modern English has the following pattern. There is a P phoneme and a B phoneme. The P phoneme is realized as a voiceless aspirated plosive pretty much all the time, except if it's immediately preceded by a S in the same morpheme, that is, the same meaningful chunk of a word. In that case, it's a voiceless unaspirated plosive. So it's aspirated in pepper, price, upper, cup of tea, but it's unaspirated in spin, spell. On the other hand, the B phoneme can be realized as a voiced plosive pretty much all the time, but it's often realized as a voiceless aspirated plosive at the start of a word, especially if the word is at the beginning of an utterance, if there's no other word immediately before it. So I can say abandon, abrasive, bill, borrow with a voiced plosive, but I can also say bill, borrow with an unaspirated, voiceless plosive. If you're an English speaker and you're confused about this, it's because your brain categorizes the sounds this way, not this way. Pin and bin sound a lot more different than bin and bin, because your brain is a lot more entrained to one distinction than it is to the other. The thing is, English dialects and the Germanic languages in general have lots of different distributions. American English speakers are more likely to have unaspirated plosives between a stressed and an unstressed vowel, upper rather than upper. Traditional Northern English and Scots barely aspirate any plosives at all, din rather than tin. Standard German has a similar aspiration pattern to my dialect of English, with aspirated plosives except after s, or sh, as the case may be. Standard Dutch generally has unaspirated plosives. Icelandic has, again, a similar pattern to mine. Overall, because this is a kind of unusual pattern that appears in only distantly related Germanic languages, there's a good reason to think it might be quite an old pattern. Maybe the Germanic parent language, Proto-Germanic, spoken around the same time as Latin, already had this weird distribution of aspirated and unaspirated plosives. There's actually a phonetic description from as far back as the 1500s that describes aspirated plosives in English fairly unambiguously. That's in London English. So that's p, t, k. But that's still a good 500 years after the end of the period we're talking about here. What can general principles about sound change tell us here? First of all, Is it a more common sound change for aspirated plosives to become unaspirated, or for unaspirated plosives to become aspirated? It's a bit tricky to find these things out. There's a website called the Index Diachronica, which is a big database of sound changes in actual languages, but this isn't considered an academic resource. Another potential problem with it is that most of the sound changes it lists are reconstructed historical ones, so if you don't know exactly what the reasoning was behind the reconstruction, you risk some tautological situation where ancient languages are reconstructed as having this sound change because other reconstructed languages are, because other reconstructed languages are. Coming up with a solid assessment here is quite tricky. You could point to examples like Northern English having largely unaspirated plosives 80 years ago and now having aspirated ones, as an example of a change from unaspirated to aspirated. But there's a good case to be made that that's just because of Southern English trends bulldozing traditional Northern English features, rather than an internal change in Northern English. But this spread of features can easily happen across the boundaries of languages that are spoken near each other geographically. For example, Germanic languages could have originally had aspiration, and then some could have lost it because they were spoken next to where French was spoken, or something like that. I think it's likely that this basic pattern is quite old. Such a specific pattern is unlikely to appear independently in several different languages. I think it's very likely that Southern Old English speakers had a similar aspiration pattern to me, with voiceless plosives being aspirated in most or all situations except after s. And I think it's possible that the Germanic dialect continuum in continental Europe has always had some dialects with unaspirated plosives, and that this lack of aspiration ended up being popular in Northern Old English, leading to the pattern that we see in traditional dialects now. However, I acknowledge the possibility that all of England was aspirating in the Old English period, and unaspirated plosives emerged as an internal sound change in Northern England or Scotland at some point. Now, in my big tirade here, I've missed a lot of things. For one, I've only used p and b as examples. There are plenty of other plosives in the Germanic languages, t, d, k, and g in modern English alone. Also, in fixating on whether or not they were aspirated, I seem to have taken for granted that the letters p and b represented plosives at all, let alone that they were pronounced bilabially with the two lips pressed together. The Old English letter p corresponds to a bilabial plosive like p in other Germanic languages, except for German where it corresponds to f and pf. The common European sound associated with this letter p is a bilabial plosive, albeit often an unaspirated one, b, and German in general shows overwhelming evidence that it had a large change in its consonant system since the medieval period, so that's why it's the outlier here. For these reasons, p is the most likely pronunciation of this sound in Old English. The same things apply to the letter b being pronounced b, and to the letters t and d being pronounced t and d, although there are little phonetic details that are slightly debatable here as well. It's unclear whether t and d were alveolar, t, d, or dental, t, d. Alveolar is far more widespread in modern English. Many traditional dialects of English do dentalize t and d if they come before a tapped r sound. Drink, trap. Alexander Ellis recorded this in his dialect survey in the late 1800s, and researcher Warren Maguire has more recently made a handy map of this. It seems restricted to Northern England, although having a tapped ra in that position rather than an approximate ra is also a more northern thing anyway, so it's possible those are connected. Finally, the realizations of the letters C and G. These are perhaps the most complicated of all the potential plosives. Old English writers didn't use the letter K. The Old English letter C corresponds to various sounds in modern English. It broadly corresponds to the voiceless velar plosive k, as in cat, to the alveolar affricate ch, as in cheese, and where you have s followed by c in Old English, it corresponds to the modern English post-alveolar fricative sh, as in sheep. Let's start with the k realization. This agrees with other Germanic languages. Cat in modern English corresponds with this spelling in Old English, corresponds with Katze in German, and so on. Where the Old English letter C corresponds to a k sound in modern English, it's likely to represent a k sound in Old English too, for all the reasons that the other plosives, represent their normal European qualities. Well, what about the ch realization? Take these words in Old English where C corresponds to ch in modern English. If you look at the cognates in other Germanic languages, it's usually k. Remember that I said systematic sound changes tend to happen either across the board wherever a sound appears, or wherever it appears in relation to certain other sounds. Looking at Old English spellings, the pattern pops out quickly. If the Old English letter C appears before or after the letters I, E or ash, it ends up as a ch in modern English. These letters all represent vowels that we decided were probably at the front of the vowel space in Old English, and so this starts to look like a common sound change called palatalisation, where the front tongue position of certain vowels starts to leak over into neighbouring consonants, making them have a more front tongue position as well. This is the exact same type of sound change that's responsible for the letter C representing two different sounds in languages like Spanish and Italian. In fact, Italian palatalisation looks a lot like the distribution we see in Old English. The letter C represents k before back vowels and ch before front vowels. As far as I can see, this is a fantastic general explanation for the presence of ch in modern English where you have k in other Germanic languages. But of course this doesn't tell us exactly when the palatalisation took place. Had it happened yet in late West Saxon Old English, let's say? There are some ways that we can narrow this down. It's often noted that the Frisian languages, both modern and old, have a lot in common with English, and there seems to be some kind of close relationship between the two. That Frisian languages are close cousins to English, closer in fact than other languages like German and Dutch. And Frisian shows some evidence of palatalisation of k, which appears in texts fairly early on. Frisian writers spell the word church like this, even while Old English writers are still spelling it with a C. This is a point possibly in favour of palatalisation starting on the continent and coming over to England in the 400s AD already in the process of happening, because it's postulating less sound changes if we imagine that palatalisation happened once on the continent and that some of the speakers with palatalisation came to England and some of them stayed and became Frisian speakers. In the Middle English period, we see writers start to use the spelling ch in concordance with where there are ch sounds in modern English, so presumably the change had happened by then. The introduction of Old Norse loanwords to English narrows it down even further. English words that seem to be loans from Old Norse seem not to show palatalisation. K remains k in situations where it would have become ch had it been a native English word. For example, the word kid, meaning a baby goat, seems to be an Old Norse loan that was introduced after palatalisation was already complete, hence it didn't undergo palatalisation itself and become chid. The weight of all this evidence certainly pushes palatalisation back before the height of the Danelaw in the 800s, because that's probably when the bulk of Old Norse loanwords came into the language. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Alfred the Great was saying chaup with a ch. There may have been some intermediate stage like a palatal plosive. Ch, chaup. Before we go any further with this pesky letter C, let's remind ourselves that the combination SC emerges as sh in modern English. And this actually happens regardless of whether there's a front vowel after it. Shop, shoe, there are plenty of examples of sh words that had a back vowel in Old English. This sh thing is actually less unusual across Germanic languages in general. Where English has sheep, German has schaf, Dutch has schaap, but modern West Frisian has skiep. Scandinavian languages go both ways as well, with some having sh and some having sk. Given that early Germanic languages spell this as though it were a s sound followed by a k sound, I'd suggest that it did start off as sk in Germanic, with some languages like Old English developing it to something else. Again, this is likely to have happened in English before the height of the Danelaw, because Old Norse loanwords to English often retain sk rather than having sh. Look at the oft-cited doublet shirt, a native Old English word, and skirt, an Old Norse loanword. It wouldn't make sense for these Old Norse loanwords to have been borrowed before palatalisation, because if that were the case, they would have undergone palatalisation themselves. Again though, it's possible this didn't go immediately from sk straight to sh. There may have been an intermediate stage like stj. I don't think it's clear exactly how slowly the phonetic process played out once it had started. Let's move on to the letter G and the sounds it might have represented. This is another horrible minefield, although it mirrors C in a lot of ways. This emerges as modern English g by default, but as modern English y, where it came around front vowels in Old English. To work out the time that this happened, we again have some limiting factors. Old Norse loanwords to English retain that g sound, hence get and give rather than yet and yiv. This suggests palatalisation prior to the height of the Danelaw, again because that's where Old Norse loanwords are likely to have come into the language. Germanic languages that don't have this palatalisation of g do still have some instances of the y sound. For example, German doesn't generally have palatalisation of g, but it does have some words with y, ja meaning yes, or ja meaning year. By any reasonable interpretation of the other Germanic languages, these words have probably had a y sound ever since Proto-Germanic, and yet Old English writers also spell this sound with a g, suggesting that they do indeed use it for both g and y sounds. So the Old English letter G represented two sounds by the late West Saxon period. One of those was, in fact it probably represented two the entire time. One of those sounds was the y sound that had been y ever since Proto-Germanic, so the sound in words like year. That merged with the velar from very early Old English, which palatalised to y. And then the other sound represented by G was the survival of that velar where it wasn't palatalised, and that survives in modern English as g. Now you might notice that I'm being very careful to avoid saying that the velar was actually pronounced g in the Old English period, and that's because scholars aren't sure whether it was. In Proto-Germanic, there are various structural reasons for thinking it was probably a velar fricative, r, and a velar fricative survives in this phoneme in Dutch. And structural reasons, again, suggest that it was a fricative in very early Old English before it palatalised, and I'll explain why. If you had a situation where very early Old English had voiceless and voiced velar plosives, k and g, you would expect there to be a parallel process of palatalisation, where they both, the voiced one underwent basically the same process except of being voiced the whole time. So what that would look like is, because the voiceless one went from k probably to a palatal plosive ch, and then assimilated to the affricate ch, as we've already discussed, you would expect the voiced one to start off as the velar plosive g, front to the palatal plosive j, and then assimilate to the affricate j. So you'd expect it to be j, but we don't find j in modern English, we find y. So, well, we do find j in certain contexts, but that's for later. But we mostly find y in situations where it's palatalised. So that suggests it was originally a velar fricative r, which fronted to a palatal fricative y, and then that underwent lenition, I suppose, to the semivowel y. So yeah, it was probably a fricative in very early Old English. The velar that remained and didn't get palatalised presumably was a fricative for at least a little while after palatalisation. It was still r. I think it's one of the kind of grey areas of Old English phonology, exactly when this changed to g, because it clearly did at some point, because it's now g in modern English. Some scholars would argue that it changed to g soon after palatalisation. Some would argue that it stayed r fairly late in the Old English period. Not sure. For both the letters C and G, Old English writers gave no indication when they were palatalised and when they weren't. Modern scholars have to work it out. This is usually fairly easy because you can just apply the rule about palatalisation around front vowels, and it often corresponds with modern English pronunciation anyway. But there are probably cases where scholars get it wrong, either because the author of the text had a slightly different accent than the one we're reconstructing, or possibly because of dialects that did have palatalisation, borrowing words from dialects that didn't. Finally, you have some instances of C followed by G in spelling. These correspond to the j sound in modern English, like in bridge and edge. except in some cases where they correspond to g, as in frog. This corresponds to various sounds in other Germanic languages, k in German, ch and r in Dutch, in general velar sounds. This hints at another case of palatalisation in the English branch. But we've established that older r palatalised to y in Old English, so why a different result here? Is j a palatalised form of earlier r, or is it something else? If we look to the earliest spellings we have available to us, we see that this often corresponds to doubled g's in other early Germanic languages, sometimes with an added j. Researchers have concluded that the most likely course of development is Proto-Germanic had clusters of r followed by y, rya clusters. By the West Germanic period, instances of r before y hardened and geminated to g, as in agyu, and then in Old English this g cluster palatalised to j. Old English writers were normally happy to double letters when they heard a geminate consonant, so maybe this creative spelling of CG suggests that at least some degree of palatalisation had happened very early on, along with other cases of palatalisation in, k becoming ch and so on. The fricatives are a little bit simpler, but not that much simpler. These are consonants where the airflow through the vocal tract is blocked, but not completely, so the air can escape through a very narrow pathway. As such, fricatives can be held for as long as you can breathe out. Th, s, z. We've already been over sh and r sounds, which are fricatives in Old English. But we also find 4 letters that we haven't covered yet, which very often represent fricatives in modern Indo-European languages. These are F, S, thorn, and H. In modern European languages that use these letters, they tend to represent f, s, th, and h respectively, with some variation. F, S, and thorn in Old English spelling regularly correspond with f, s, and th in modern English pronunciation, except in certain situations. The same rule applies very neatly to all 3 correspondences. By default, they emerge as f, s, and th in modern English, but in situations where the letter comes between 2 letters representing sounds with glottal voicing, they emerge as v, z, th in modern English. I'll give you some examples to show what I mean. This word emerges as modern wolf with f. However, this word emerges as modern wolves with v. This word emerges as modern leaf, yet this word emerges as modern beaver, path, but other. This represents a straightforward and common sound change. When a voiceless fricative like f, s, th comes between 2 voiced sounds, it's easier to just keep the voicing going throughout than it is to stop the voicing just for the fricative and then start it again afterwards. So people just let it run through the fricative. Wolvus instead of wolfus. Newcomers to Old English sometimes get a bit confused by thorn for a few reasons. The first one is that it doesn't exist in the modern English alphabet because it's gone out of use. It's been replaced with th, which now represents both the th and the sounds as they appear in modern English. Another thing is that thorn ends up kind of looking like a P, and so when people encounter Old English texts, they tend to assume that it's supposed to be pronounced P. This is not true at all. The letter was adapted from a Germanic rune, presumably because most European languages don't have a th sound. Classical Latin didn't have a th sound, and so they needed their own letter for it. It's not supposed to represent P. It's not designed to look like a P. Probably Old English scribes didn't think of them as being similar at all. Another thing is that thorn alternates with another letter, eth, and that's this letter, which is a medieval D with a curved tail with a cross through it. And in fact, I think for the majority of the period, eth may actually have been more common than thorn. Now, the reason this confuses people is because, and this is quite understandable, there are 2 sounds here, as I said. There's the voiceless th and the voiced the. The two sounds are in what's called complementary distribution with each other. You can completely predict what sound is going to come out based on the environment that the letter is in, or the environment that the phoneme is in more strictly. So these are allophones of the same phoneme because they never contrast with each other. If it's between two voiced sounds, it's only ever going to be the. If it's not between two voiced sounds, it's only ever going to be th. So they never contrast, so they're the same phoneme. Speakers probably thought of them as the same sound, which is why they're not distinguished in spelling. However, when you see that there are two letters, which are sometimes used interchangeably by authors in the same manuscript, the confusion then arises of, well, hang on, if there are two sounds and there are two letters, surely it stands to reason that one letter is supposed to represent one sound and the other letter is supposed to represent the other sound. This is heightened by the fact that in Old Norse that was actually true for the most part. The letter thorn tended to represent the th sound, the letter eth represented the sound. In Old English it's clear, structurally speaking, that the distribution of the th and the allophones was governed by the voicing of the surrounding sounds in pretty much exactly the same way as was the case with f and s. There's no way of reconciling structurally any other argument, really. So it's quite clear that authors, for whatever reason, were just using the thorn and eth letters pretty much interchangeably to represent this phoneme, which could be pronounced either th or the. So basically what I'm trying to say is which letter you find is irrelevant to the pronunciation. The pronunciation is determined by the phonological environment. Letter doesn't mean anything. Another point of confusion is that there's this whole kind of misconception around thorn that sometimes it was pronounced y, or sometimes the letter y was pronounced th, or whatever. This arises from a misconception about printing presses from much later than the Old English period, so ignore anything to do with that. Thorn and y, well, the letter y didn't exist in Old English, but thorn and the y sound had absolutely nothing to do with each other at all. That shouldn't cause confusion. There's some variation, even beyond the thorn eth thing. So early on in the period, many writers spelt these th and the sounds with th, which has of course become standard again now. So if you see th, that in many cases will actually represent the th and the sounds as well. The last fricative doesn't fit the pattern of the others. It's represented by the letter h. The sound represented by h in modern English is obviously the h sound for most speakers, and it's distributionally restricted. It only occurs at the starts of syllables, never at the ends. In modern English you can have the word ham, but never the word mah. However, in Old English the distribution of the letter h is as free as any other consonant, occurring at the start and ends of syllables, and in clusters with other sounds. Where the Old English letter h occurs at the start of a syllable, it regularly corresponds with and is clearly the ancestor of the h sound in modern English. So what about if it's at the end of a syllable? What has that given rise to in modern English if it's not h anymore? Well, you know those weird GH spellings in modern English that are now often either silent or pronounced as a f sound? Those correspond regularly with h spellings in Old English. The fact that they consistently appear in Old English spellings suggests that they were pronounced back then, and the equivalent sounds are pronounced in other West Germanic languages. Where in English you have night, sight, though, in German you have Nacht, Sicht, doch. These contain the voiceless fricatives ch and ch, rather than the glottal h. These back fricatives actually exist much closer to home as well in Scots, necht, secht. So the interpretation here is clearly simple enough, that broadly in Old English, h represented a voiceless palatal, velar or uvular fricative if it came at the end of a syllable, and probably a h sound if it came at the start of a syllable. Because in the Middle English period these sounds behave differently depending on whether they came after a front or a back vowel, Some have suggested that they followed a similar pattern to modern Standard German, with palatal ch after a front vowel and velar ch after a back vowel. For what it's worth, which I think is something, the idea that it was originally ch in pre-Old English and then it became ch after a front vowel fits very neatly in with the whole palatalisation thing, because we're taking the sound represented by G in later Old English to be a fricative in very early Old English, r. That's actually the voiced counterpart to the voiceless fricative ch, which is represented by H. So in that sense it makes sense, it's symmetrical in a naturalistic way if it reflects the same sound changes to some extent by palatalising. I don't think that proves anything, but it's neat. And phonological systems, phonological changes tend to be quite neat. Ultimately, these are all realisations of the same phoneme in Old English. Speakers almost certainly considered them basically the same sound as each other, hence they were spelled with the same letter. The final thing to mention here is that many Old English words, at least in spelling, began with sequences like HL, HN, HR, or HW. The HW spellings correspond to WH spellings in modern English, which are still pronounced as voiceless wh sounds in some dialects. These Old English spellings may have represented straightforward sequences, chla, chna, chr, chwa, or they may have represented something more subtle, just voiceless versions of what were normally voiced consonants, chla, chna, chr, chwa. Both of these possibilities have been argued for, and I don't know if either comes out obviously in favour. Whatever the realisations of these sequences were, and it's very possible that they were different from dialect to dialect, Old English speakers almost certainly did think of them as sequences of the H phoneme followed by L, N, R, whatever. It wasn't just a diacritical thing in the writing, they probably did actually think of them that way. We can say this from a few angles. One of those is that these sequences were clearly at one point in history straightforward sequences of ch followed by l, r, n, and so on. The way we know that is because this whole H phoneme in the Germanic languages, whether it represented h or ch or ch, it corresponds very regularly with the k phoneme of a lot of other Indo-European languages. And what's happened here is that in the very distant past, before even the Proto-Germanic period, this phoneme was k, or maybe an unaspirated g, and it underwent a process of lenition through a sound change that's described by Grimm's law, and it turned to a fricative within the same place of articulation in the mouth, and that place of articulation is velar, so it turned into ch. The outcome would have been ch immediately afterwards. So at some point these were actually sequences of chl, chr, chna. Whether they still were by the Old English period is unclear, but the only one that survives in any modern English dialect is hwa, which, as I said, is spelt with WH in standard English spelling, although it's only contrastive in certain dialects. So Jackson Crawford, for example, would presumably say Wales for the country, but Whales for the mammal. And people who have this hua thing still tend to regard it as a sequence of h followed by a w, even though in realization it's very often, perhaps always, just a voiceless w, a single sound, hua, hua. So even now people still regard it phonemically as H and W in a sequence, although maybe there are some analyses that have it as a separate phoneme in its own right, I'm not sure. There are two sounds in Old English that are called semivowels. These are vowels based on the description I gave earlier of sounds that don't completely obstruct the vocal tract, but they behave like consonants in that they can form the start and end, the onset and coda of a syllable. The trouble is, we've already inadvertently discussed one of these semivowels, y, when we were discussing the letter G. That leaves us with one other letter which corresponds to a semivowel in modern English. Old English writers flip-flopped a little bit around what letter to use for this sound. At first it was sometimes represented using two letter U's, one after the other, and throughout the period it was often represented using a borrowed runic letter called win. Later in the history of English this would be replaced with the letter W, which is still used now. But however you look at it, these letters were clearly all supposed to represent the Old English ancestor of the modern W sound, because they correspond very regularly to it. So how was this pronounced in Old English? The instinct of a lot of people is to go with V, because that's the sound associated with this letter in German. It's not just lay people, but also archaeologists and linguists that don't have specific knowledge of Old English. I think this is partly because of a sort of tendency we have to assume that some languages are kind of historical monoliths that don't change, like German and Latin, for example, and that other languages are derivations or bastardizations of those monolith languages. The assumption that if there's a difference between English and German, that must be because English changed something and German kept it the same, because English is the bastardized language. I think this is the same bias that leads a lot of people to think that any difference between British and American English must be a result of Americans messing the language up. The assumption that, British English dialects are kind of the main ones, the monolithic ones, and American dialects are an offshoot. But it's not just that bias that's at play here. Most Germanic languages associate this letter with the V sound. English is kind of an outlier there. But assuming Old English used V here is immediately problematic if you think about the series of fricative sounds that we've already discussed. Old English had a V sound as an allophone of the F phoneme. If there was also a separate V phoneme, this would have to have a complex relationship with the F phoneme. They could appear in opposition to each other at the beginnings of words, but if either phoneme occurred between two vowels, the distinction would collapse because they'd both be pronounced V in that context. In a language with no rigid spelling standard and notorious variety in spelling, you'd expect writers to use the two letters interchangeably between voiced sounds to reflect the lack of actual phonemic distinction, but they're consistently kept separate. Some words have win and some words have f. Well, what about the possibility that we're wrong about the fricatives and f just didn't have a v allophone, it was always pronounced f? One wolf, many wolfus, rather than wolf wolvus. And that leaves room for win to be pronounced like v, perhaps one vulf, many vulfus. This is obviously tempting because this sounds a lot more like German, but we can't just go on the vibe of what it sounds like, we have to be systematic. At some point in the Old English period, this intervocalic voicing rule must have applied to the f phoneme, producing a v allophone, because otherwise we wouldn't have wolf wolves in later English. It is possible for these kinds of sound changes to be staggered. For example, for intervocalic voicing of s to happen maybe decades before intervocalic voicing of f. But this is stretching plausibility quite a lot just because we want to make the language sound more like modern German. Another clue is the development of the writing system. Germanic languages started to be written in the Roman alphabet in the mid-first millennium. At the time Germanic languages were first written in the Roman alphabet, the letters V and U were one and the same, as they had been in classical Latin hundreds of years earlier. In classical Latin this made some sense. They represented a vowel, U, or its corresponding semivowel, W. Old English writers used the letter to represent the U vowel, and, both long and short, but they seem to make a point of not using it on its own to represent any consonant. In the Romance languages at this point in time, the consonantal pronunciation of this letter was the bilabial fricative, va. Is it that German writers didn't feel that this letter was appropriate for any phoneme in their language? You could speculate that early writers felt that using this vowel letter for a consonant was just a bit awkward, but that's not a good argument because they were often happy to use the letter in doubled form, UU, to represent a consonant, which is surely more awkward if you're trying to keep to roughly one letter per phoneme. They later move away from the letter U altogether and just start straight up using a rune, adapted for the Roman alphabet. This is extremely weird behaviour around one phoneme, and to me it's perfectly consistent with the idea that Old English writers felt the Roman alphabet didn't have any letter that captured this sound properly at the time they were trying to adapt it. So if this sound was w in Old English, how do you explain the fact that the other Germanic languages have shifted to v, along with a load of other Indo-European languages? Well, it's a fairly common sound change with lots of precedent in other languages, and unlike with unrelated animal populations in evolution, languages can pass material amongst themselves fairly easily. Once w becomes v in a fairly dominant dialect somewhere in the continental Germanic dialect continuum, it can easily spread. Linguists are pretty much in universal agreement that that's what happened here. It goes a lot further back than Germanic as well. A reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European is a lot more natural and robust if you postulate two semivowels, w and y, and it's that w that became the w in Germanic languages and ultimately English, and also the w in Latin, which went on to become a v as well. It's a matter of near certainty that German, Dutch, Icelandic, all of those languages started off saying w and changed it to v more recently. Along with all the horrible consonant clusters involving h, w or win had some of its own consonant clusters, so you could get win-r or win-l at the start of a word. Let's say wr, wl. The wr spellings still survive in modern English in words like right, although that's obviously not pronounced wr anymore. It's not clear how it was pronounced in Old English, although it was clearly different from just writing r or l on their own. We discuss exactly how r and l were pronounced in the next section anyway. The most straightforward interpretation is that these were just pronounced ura and ula, but some scholars have suggested that the wl maybe represented a velarized l at the start of a word, so la. So an example in a word would be litan rather than litan if it had the normal l. I don't know which of these I favour. Maybe just the most straightforward interpretation of the spelling, which is ra, la. In the interest of showing you where the wiggle room is, I don't see any particular reason why this couldn't have been vra and vla with a v. I know I've just gone on the whole tirade about how win represented w, but this is a very specific phonological environment, so it's and as it leaves no trace on modern English, it's remotely possible that for some or maybe even most speakers it might have been vra, vla, but I definitely don't think that's the most realistic interpretation. One thing that I got a comment about on the community post was there are lots of situations in Old English spelling where you have I followed by G, for example in this word, which means heavy. In modern English, such things come out as E, and because the letter G represented a palatalized sound after front vowels, you might think, well, shouldn't IG just represent E? Isn't that how it should be pronounced? Because the y semivowel represented by G is basically identical in articulation to standard IPA E. It's just a semivowel version of it, a semivocalic version of it. So shouldn't this just be pronounced E? Well, the answer is maybe it was. There are other possibilities as well. The G may still, in these situations, or in many situations, have represented a palatal fricative rather than a pure semivowel. So it might have been E, which is still something you see in I think, Scouse and maybe some other English dialects nowadays. So that would enforce a bit of separation between the two sounds. It may be that the I component was laxer. It had a laxer tongue position, so there is a slight raising of the tongue during articulation. So it could have been E, or indeed E, with those two things I've just said combined. Or it may have just been straight E. If it was just E, it's difficult to see why writers wouldn't more often just spell it with an I. So I would say there was probably something differentiating the I vowel from the subsequent semivowel. Now these semivowel sequences can happen with lots of combinations of vowel and semivowel. So in this word, we presumably have a pronunciation something like way, or way, if you're doing the fricative pronunciation. In this word, you presumably have something like die, And note that way and day in Old English were pronounced with two different vowels, way, day. And with the back vowels and with w, you have things like ow, and all of these things sound like they should be diphthongs. In fact, on a phonetic level, as I say, they are diphthongs. And so people sometimes, I've done videos where people have said Old English didn't have an ow diphthong. And, well, how else do you interpret long A followed by W as other than ow? It's likely that Old English speakers didn't really process them as diphthongs, whatever that means. They probably thought of them as vowel consonant sequences. But yeah, so these situations did exist. You'll also have noticed by now that the sounds of Old English, and in fact the sounds of most languages, are arranged into little groups that share similar features, like the plosives or the fricatives. And the last of these groups is what I'll call the liquids. We have two more letters, R and L. We'll start with L, which is the simpler of the two. This corresponds with the modern phoneme usually pronounced L. This is another one of those that stays fairly consistent across Germanic languages, and it's consistently represented by the letter L, which represented a L sound in Latin. So there we are, that's the most likely basic pronunciation of this in Old English. However, there are a few little details that we can actually close in on here. Across European languages, there are a few very similar sounds that are represented by this letter. In English, the two most common are called the clear L, which is L, and the dark L, which is L, and that's like the clear L, but with the body of the tongue raised up to the soft palate at the same time. L, 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 L. As with other sounds, the distribution of these versions of L across English dialects is varied. This is actually one of the phonetic details of Old English that's considered to be fairly robustly reconstructible from spelling evidence. I mentioned in the section on diphthongs that what were front monophthongs in West Germanic ended up diphthongizing, gaining a backglide before certain consonants. I took it for granted in that section that those consonants were velarized. Velarized means that while you're pronouncing the consonant with its normal articulation, you also draw the body of the tongue towards the soft palate in the back of the mouth, changing the sound of the consonant slightly. The dark L, L, is the velarized one, as opposed to the clear L, L. We can tell where L was probably velarized based on when it caused vowels to break in this way. Now, this might seem tautological. We think these vowels were breaking into backing diphthongs because there was a velarized consonant after them, and we think the consonant after them was velarized because they were breaking into backing diphthongs. The reasoning isn't faulty, at least I think it isn't, for the following reason. There has clearly been a conditioned sound change in these vowels where they come before certain consonants or consonant clusters. Such sound changes need to make sense from an articulatory perspective, so they often involve some kind of assimilation, one sound becoming more similar to the other. We know that the letters L and R can quite happily represent consonants with either a front or back articulation in European languages, but the spellings of the vowels in these situations strongly suggest that they were originally front and are here gaining a back element. The outcome of those considerations is that L and R were both probably velarized in certain situations, causing the front vowels to break. And perhaps we can tentatively extend that to suggest that they're more likely not to have been velarized in situations where they didn't cause vowels to break. This actually varies from dialect to dialect, but in West Saxon we're broadly thinking velarized L if it came before another consonant or if it was doubled, and unvelarized L in other situations. As I said, the pronunciation of the letter R mirrors that fairly closely. Its basic pronunciation in Old English is not known, and European languages use the letter in all sorts of ways. By convention, it's been assumed that the Old English letter represented an alveolar trill, ra, although plenty of scholars have said the trill is not very likely compared to a tap, ra, which is still present in plenty of English dialects, or even an approximant like ra, which is the most common reflex of the sound in modern English. One thing that is clear is that the basic pronunciation is likely to have been alveolar, something like r, 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 and not uvula or vela, nothing like the r of languages like German. This is because of the behaviour of the vowels that I've just been over. If R caused vowels to break to backing diphthongs in some situations and not others, it's likely that there was a back articulation and a front one used in different environments. The pronunciation of R is a big problem in reconstructions of Old English for fun on YouTube, because people really notice when you pronounce R differently. It's a very big impressionistic thing for people, but we really don't know how it was pronounced in Old English. I've thought long and hard about how to approach the issue of historical development and of dialects, because I think historical development is important because Old English in the 500s AD was very structurally different to Old English in the 1000s AD, and so it's anachronistic to take one and put it onto the other. Textbook Old English, as most people learn it nowadays, didn't emerge until relatively late in the period. So I think that development is important. As for dialects, I wanted to make this pretty comprehensive in terms of dialects, but I also didn't want to make it like those textbooks, which quite understandably don't really deal with the fine phonetics of what a Northumbrian accent sounded like in Old English, because you can't really recover much of that. But instead they deal with broad structural things like the EA and the EO diphthongs seem to have merged in spelling in Northumbrian, and South Northumbrian they merged a different way, and stuff like that, where you're talking about the structure of the system and speculating about the phonological structure of how it worked in speakers' minds, but you're not necessarily commenting that confidently about the phonetics and how it sounded. And I think most people here today are probably more interested in the phonetics. If you are interested in structural phonological things, Richard Hogg has a fantastic book from, I think, about 2011, which goes into detail about the development and mentions differences between dialects. What I think I'll do is give an example of how very early Old English is likely to have sounded at the time when migrants from the West Germanic dialect continuum came to Britain, and starting off on the continent probably having already had very, very similar dialects to each other, those dialects seem to have levelled even more in England, and only then, after they merged into a kind of homogeneous soup of dialects, did they begin diversifying into the Old English dialect. So I'm going to give you an example of how that early homogeneous dialect must have sounded, and then I'm going to give you some examples of the differences between later Old English dialects, and then I'm going to talk about the end of the period. What I would say in general about Old English dialects is that because you start off with this relatively homogeneous West Germanic soup all the way up, England, as it would come to be, dialectal diversity probably took some time to actually start emerging. within a couple of hundred years there must have been some differences, but I don't think we should imagine millions and millions of dialects right from the off. By the end of the Old English period there probably was a fair bit of dialectal diversity, but early on there really may not have been much at all. It's certainly clear from the spread of sound changes that we can reconstruct from spelling evidence that sound changes spread through Old English very, fairly easily. It's certainly not as if the Northumbrians were isolated and never heard a southern accent in their lives, and the southerners never knew what a northerner sounded like, and there was total separation and they went their separate ways. Pretty much all of the major sound changes that happened in the Old English period, whether they started in the south or the north or the Midlands, made their way around the whole country with only fairly minor modification. These people clearly talked to each other, travelled into each other's areas, did trade with each other, and so Old English remains a lot more homogeneous from the outside than you might think. It's possible that this is something that's happening in upper class dialects and not so much in working class dialects. We have, as far as we can tell, pretty much no evidence of class differences in Old English dialects. We don't know really what sort of working class Old English would have sounded like, or how different it was to the I suppose the ecclesiastical dialects that were getting written down. They may have been pretty much the same. I think there is some kind of fringe suggestions that a lot of the sound changes and grammatical changes in Middle English may have started fairly early on in the Old English period in normal colloquial speech, and that literate people were just keeping a very conservative form of Old English in writing, so that we as historians can't see when the Middle English changes began occurring, because we're reading a very, very old-fashioned version of Old English for the time that it was written. I don't get the impression that this is a very widely held view, but it is one possibility. But anyway, so very early Old English must have lacked a lot of the sound changes that characterise later Old English. So, for example, vowel breaking, the only diphthongs at first were probably the ones that it had inherited from West Germanic. There was probably barely any palatalisation. It seems like the major palatalisation changes did happen later in the period, although the fact that Frisian also has palatalisation in similar situations, as Richard Hogg says, suggests that maybe somehow there was some tendency for velars to palatalise around front vowels. Perhaps some dialects had them allophonically palatalised in the very early Old English period, and that only became adopted as a very big sound change later on in both English and in continental Frisian. But yeah, largely unpalatalised velar consonants, although there was a velar semivowel y, which had always existed in the Germanic languages in words like year. It would sound altogether like a very different language to textbook Old English. I'm going to read the opening few lines of Beowulf that I've converted into what the earliest form of unwritten Old English is likely to have sounded like. Bear in mind this form of Beowulf isn't written down anywhere, it's just an example that I've kind of triangulated based on what sound changes are shared with Frisian and which ones aren't shared with Frisian.
Chwat. Wys gair danio yn iar dahum, thewdo kuningo thrumigo frugnun, huothai athulingo solianu framidun. Oft skeldu skauving skathano thrautu monogum magithum, medu setlo avatugun.
So as I say, you'll notice those palatal consonants are nowhere to be heard. It's still k, r and sk, where in later Old English you have ch, y and sh. There aren't anywhere near as many diphthongs. You'd hear a lot of a, e and I, where later Old English has au, el and iu. And finally, there are just more syllables in general. In later Old English, a lot of material and unstressed syllables has been lost. So now let's listen to Beowulf in something like the later West Saxon dialect, according more closely to how it's usually reconstructed.
What? Weg ardena in jaar dagum theod kuninga trumjefrunon húsa aðlingas ellen fremedon. Oft skyldskjeving shadenathratum manigum maidum meldosetla of tauch.
By now, those palatal consonants have emerged and become ch, y, and sh, and there are a lot more diphthongs at this point which have arisen through various processes, mostly in the prehistoric period, before any texts were written. Somebody on the community post I put asked whether I could put in an alternative pronunciation to show how much room for manoeuvre there is within the reconstruction. So here's my attempt at doing that.
What? Weg ardena in jaar dagum theod kuninga trumjefrunon húsa aðlingas ellen fremedon. Oft skyldskjeving shadenathratum manigum maidum meldosetla of tauch.
As you can see, there is a decent amount of room for manoeuvre in terms of the vowel quality and exactly how far the palatalisation of the consonants has gone at this point. The two interpretations of the same phonology sound almost like two completely different accents. So at this later stage in the period, what can we say about Old English regional dialects? Well, first of all, scholars usually divide the dialect according to major kingdoms: West Saxon for Wessex, and then Kentish, Mercian and Northumbrian for Kent, Mercia and Northumbria. In practice, there were much finer grain differences than this which show up in spelling. Historical linguists often differentiate between North Northumbrian and South Northumbrian, for example, or early West Saxon and late West Saxon. Now, early West Saxon and late West Saxon were related in the way that the names would suggest. Early West Saxon dominates and then late West Saxon dominates afterwards. But there's some suggestion that the two dialects were not directly related, that late West Saxon was not the direct descendant of early West Saxon. Maybe it was descended from a dialect of early West Saxon that had been less dominant, and then it became more dominant in the later period. By the 900s AD, West Saxon has long since lost the long and short vowels, which have merged with long and short e. It's also lost the long and short ew diphthongs, which have gone in a couple of directions. In situations where they would I mutate, they've become ew, and in other situations they've ended up merging with el and el. That ew and ew pair of diphthongs is also what our and our changed to under I mutation, so that's another structural feature of the system. Towards the end of the period, these West Saxon ew and ew diphthongs are starting to monophthongize to either e and e or e and e. The other major southern dialect is Kentish, which is spoken over a fairly small area. Kentish also sees long and short merging with e, and this happens at a similar time to West Saxon, but it also sees long and short u merging to e. There are also signs of being pronounced e. So depending on how you interpret the spellings, the front part of the vowel system may only consist of e and e and their short counterparts, which is very plausible, I think, but as I don't think that leaves any trace in any modern dialect, it's hard to get that triangulation factor on it to confirm that it's not just some weird spelling thing. It seems like the long ow and the long eo developed as something like ya and yo in Kentish, and there are also signs that long ew and eo merged into just ew, whereas short ew and el merged into just el. I'd stress that there's more wiggle room in the pronunciation of Kentish for reasons I've touched on, but all of this does suggest that it had a regional accent which would probably have been fairly distinctive from the perspective of a West Saxon speaker. The other dialects spoken roughly north of London are grouped together as the Anglian dialects because they seem to have had some things in common with each other. So those are now in hindsight called Mercian, spoken in what you'd call the Midlands, and Northumbrian, spoken in the north of England and the southernmost bit of Scotland. Again, if you're reading a textbook and you see someone talk about the Anglian dialects, they're talking about Mercian and Northumbrian together. Anglian is a lot less represented in text form, but we have enough to get an idea of quite a few differences from southern dialects. First and foremost, the long and short vowels survived a lot better in Anglian, in Mercian and Northumbrian. The long version of the vowel seems to have survived all the way up to the end of the Old English period, although the short one may have been starting to drop off by then and merge with I. In the Anglian dialects, there's also long I in a lot of situations where southern dialects have long A. Later Anglian dialects show a lot more survival of the rounding of before nasals, which makes sense because that seems to have carried on in modern Northern English and Scots. They also have lots of instances of before ul, where in southern dialects it had been fronted and then broken to al. So, for example, cold instead of chald. We've said that lots of vowels diphthongized before velarized consonants in the prehistoric Old English period, but in Mercian and Northumbrian, the Anglian dialects, this change was then reversed in a very large number of cases, monophthongizing the sounds again in what's called Anglian smoothing. Mercian covers a pretty large area which seems to have had a decent bit of dialectal variation, but it hasn't yielded that many texts. There are all sorts of interesting little postulations about different dialects of Mercian, but that would be much easier to substantiate if we had more texts. Hogg mentions a claim that West Mercian ended up with 4 unrounded short front vowels, something like I, E, and A, rather than the usual 3, I, E, and A. Mercian also shows the iu vowels merging to el, just like West Saxon does. Northumbrian, in addition to the general Anglian features I've mentioned, has extra examples of because where an I comes after a w, it can be rounded to u. This generally happens with the short vowel, we becomes w, but sometimes also with the long vowel, we becomes w. This dialect also does some sort of weird things with diphthongs. So in South Northumbrian, you see that most diphthongs that should be spelled EO and EA are all spelled EO most of the time, with some exceptions. Hogg interprets this as them being pronounced similarly, maybe as eo and ow, with similar short counterparts. I don't personally see why they couldn't have merged wholesale. North Northumbrian sees the opposite pattern. Both these diphthongs tend to be spelled EA, with some exceptions, and Hogg interprets that inversely to the other pattern, maybe air and our. There are some phonetic features which aren't necessarily pinnable to Northumbrian. They may have been localised in Northumbria or may have applied to Northern Mercian as well, so I'll discuss those here. One of those differences is that in the era of modern English, more northerly dialects are more likely to have unpalatalised forms. So where Proto-Old English had k and the g cluster, those are less likely to have palatalised the further north you go. So you get dialectal forms like kirk, brig and rig, where you'd expect church, bridge, ridge, and you get place names like Keswick, where you'd expect Chiswick or Chiswick. So this suggests, as I said, either that the k and g completely failed to palatalise in some northern dialects, which then became dominant, or the change didn't get very far and was then reversed somehow. I've heard some people suggest that maybe all of these unpalatalised forms are loan words from Old Norse, because obviously Viking influence in the north of the country was a lot greater than in the south. I've never personally thought this was that likely because it applies to some words that Old Norse doesn't seem to have had a cognate of. So, for example, the cheese word in Old Norse was oster, and I'm not sure there's any evidence that they had the word cheese or a cognate of it. So that's one of my reasons for thinking that it's not just loan words. It seemed unlikely to me that ch and j would completely revert to an earlier stage of development, purely under the influence of Old Norse. Now, Hogg maintains that perhaps the palatalisation hadn't got very far in the north. Maybe you had k and g being palatalised to ch and j, so they'd not dissimilated all the way to ch and j yet. And maybe, I think I might be adding this, I don't know if Hogg said this, but maybe it was still an allophonic difference in those dialects at the time of the earliest Viking influence. So maybe speakers still thought of ch as a different pronunciation of k, maybe they still thought of j as a different pronunciation of j. So it would have been a lot easier for Viking influence to reverse those changes. Personally, I think this is a reasonably good explanation. I think that Hogg makes the case that palatalisation definitely did stretch in, well, it certainly affected sk and r in the north. That's pretty much definite. But he makes the case that palatalisation of k and g probably did affect northern dialect as well at first. So I think well, obviously he's a lot more qualified than me, but I'm happy to accept his account that Viking influence may have reversed changes that had already started to happen.
Welund himbe wurma, raches kunnade, anhydi eur, arfode draug. Havde him toje sithe sorge and longath. Winter chalde rache waun oft on fond, sithan hina nithhad on nedeleide. Swankre seunobende on syllan man. Thas overeude, thisses swa mig. Barohilde, newas hyre brodra dauth on sevan swa sar, swa hyre silvre thing. Dat heu jaurolichon jitten havde dat heu auken was. Avren machte tristi thenchon huim thatchulde. Thas overeude, thisses swa mig. We that maid hilde, munje je frugnon. Word on grundlause joutes frie, dat him self sorgluvu, slaap alle binon. Thas overeude, thisses swa mig. Theodrich achte thriti wintra, maringa burg, that was monigum kuth. Thas overeude, thisses swa mig. We askud an eurmandriches wilvene je thocht, achte wide folk gottenadiches. Dat was grimkinning, sat sedge money sorgum je bunden, waan on ween an wiste je nauchet dat as kineriches overkomen ware. Thas overeude, thisses swa mig. Sitjet sorg chari, salum bidaled, on sevan swelcheth. Sylvum fincheth that sy ende laus aur for the dal. My thonne je thenchon, that jon thas world, witi drichten wendet je nache. Eurle monigum, are je shawath, wislichne blad sumum waane dal. That, ich be me sylvum said John Wilde. That ich wheeler was helden in ga shop. Drichne dyre. Me was Deor nama. Acht ich fellow intra folga tilne. Holdne lavord. Of that heurenda nu, leeuw kraftig man. Londricht je thag. Dat me eurlech leeuw, ar je salde. Thas overeude. Thisses swa mij.